Thanks, everyone. The sound pick up from this? Okay? All right, great. That's what this little flashing thing is, just so you know. Can you guys see okay? I just want to make sure I'm not kind of in the middle. So I'm going to talk today a bit about climate change and kind of the role that we can all play in dealing with it. And if anyone wants to get a hold of me, if you have questions, my email is billy@hitchcockcenter.org. We would be happy to host a tour for you guys at some point, so please get in touch. Yeah, we'd love you to come see the Hitchcock Center if you haven't, or come back if you have. Climate change, just the real basics, and I think all of you probably know this from your own experience, that it's getting warmer, and that means not just average temperatures, but it means that we're getting more really hot days, fewer days with snow cover, and that has a lot of implications for us, but also for all the other critters that inhabit the area. It's getting wetter, which means more really intense precipitation events, which we've all experienced. And we're seeing more quote-unquote extreme events that are not so extreme anymore. The 100-year flood happening more often than 100 years. More flooding, but also more drought, more severe storms. The new norms are really kind of challenging, what our expectations are for what the weather and the climate is like. And we, experience this in all these different ways. So, hurricanes, droughts, heat waves, floods, wildfires, storms, also, crop failure, air pollution that I'm going to talk a lot more about, and also diseases. One of the challenges we have from not having as many hard freezes is that some of the critters we'd love to see really die out don't die out. So, ticks are now a year-round issue, et cetera. So there are a lot of implications. It's not just about the weather. And then this is a summary from the Massachusetts Climate Change Plan, which is really a really solid plan that I think now has kind of charted out a roadmap for how we get to 2030, get to 2050, and really, across the state, really deal with climate change pretty comprehensively. And we should all feel pretty good that Amherst, as a municipality, has a really strong climate action plan as well. Now, the tricky thing with all these plans is not just to write the plans, then you actually have to implement the plans. And part of our job as citizens is to really hold our elected officials accountable to doing that. So I'll come back to that more later. But when you look at all the different kinds of challenges that we face in the state, there are health effects, damage to buildings and infrastructure, environmental impacts on wildlife and ecosystems, and then, costs, that we have to incur, and, both, as towns and cities, but also, economic effects. And, one of the things that is potentially an impact in this area is that more people actually may want to be moving here, because this is a place that actually has a lot of advantages in some ways in a climate change world, in addition to all the challenges that we face. So a lot of impacts, and a lot of things that no matter how much we can do to reduce the impacts of climate change, we are going to be dealing with some of these impacts now and in the future. The more we do, the better scenario we have to deal with the impacts. But it's going to be a combination of trying to reduce the amount of climate change and also kind of adapt and prepare for the changes to come. So I'm going to focus a bit on air quality as kind of a case study for what climate change looks like and what we can do about it. And air quality is kind of interesting because there's these multiple effects related to air quality and climate. When we burn fossil fuels to power our vehicles and buildings and industry and so on, that makes the air quality worse if we're burning fossil fuels, putting emissions into the air, but it also makes climate change worse. And the higher temperatures due to climate change tends to lead to more air pollution, more smog, also more wildfires, and in general worse air quality. So to the extent that we can deal with the root cause of this, which is burning fossil fuels, we can improve both air quality and climate change. So I think it's a really important place to focus. So air pollution has a lot of impacts on our health. Short term, if anyone who has any respiratory sensitivity, whether it's asthma or something else, it can cause problems. It can, irritate our respiratory passages. It can increase our blood pressure. It can increase the likelihood of heart attacks and so on. And then long term, it would increase your risk for developing asthma or COPD or bronchitis. It can reduce your lung function and so on. So, as more and more research has been done on air quality, both indoor air quality and outdoor air quality, it really is a big impact on our health. And there are particular populations who are vulnerable. People at either end of the age spectrum, people who have pre-existing health conditions, especially lung-related ones, and also women who are in pregnancy are all at higher risk for air pollution than the general population. So thinking back a little bit to the summer, does any of this look familiar, right? We had some real issues with wildfire smoke. And where were those wildfires happening? Canada, right? There were some local, but most of it was Canada. And do you know where in Canada? Does anyone know? Quebec, Montreal, where else? Nova Scotia. Also, Western Canada as well. Yeah, so I'll talk about that in a minute. And one of the things that this makes you realize is that we're all connected. It's one atmosphere, right? We can't isolate ourselves from problems that are happening elsewhere in the world. And, in particular, in the valley, you'd think, oh, we're in this wonderful rural valley. Why would we have any air quality problems? Well, it turns out that we tend to get air that comes up from the south, from New York City, in Northeast Corridor. We get air sometimes that comes from the west, from the Midwest and Midwestern power plants. We get air currents that come from the north that bring the wildfires from Canada. So in being in a valley, sometimes the air really tends to sit here. So even though it's a more rural area, we tend to have those issues as well. And this was really personal for folks here. You could see, you could feel, you could smell, you could taste, you could feel it in your throat. We had, at the Hitchcock Center, we run a great summer camp program. We had to monitor the air quality day to day to figure out what we could do outside, what we needed to do with kids who had sensitivity. We had a lot of kids with inhalers. This is something that was really, kind of up close and personal for us here, as well as in a lot of places. And one of the things that has been evolving in this region is more attention to air quality. And the Public Health Institute of Western Mass, which is based down in Springfield, has been working over the last few years to set up a whole bunch of air quality monitoring stations in the valley. And this grew out of a Pioneer Valley Asthma Coalition that they were convening, and they realized they needed to kind of get a handle on where the worst problems were. And this network has all of these low-cost sensors, about 60 or so, including one now at the Hitchcock Center, that measure small particles in the air, these really small particles that you can breathe deep into your lungs that tend to also sometimes have toxins attached to them. They really, as more research has been done, they're really one of the more important kind of indicators of potential health risks. And this map shows a bunch of these different air quality sensors, and the colors go from green to yellow to orange to red as the air quality gets worse. And we had really unhealthy air some of the time during the summer, and it was worse in Springfield often than elsewhere. Any ideas as to why that might be? Okay, Monsanto, so like industrial activity. Anything else? What else happens in Springfield? What goes through Springfield? Roads, right? A lot of traffic. And so what ends up happening in a situation like this is the wildfire smoke pollution was on top of whatever baseline pollution there was. And Springfield tends to have worse pollution than a lot of other parts of the valley. And in fact, for a long time, it was the asthma capital of the country in terms of asthma rates. I think it was like number 2. Now it's like number 12. So it's still up there, but it's better. But part of the realization is that all of these impacts add up. Whatever you already have from industry or traffic, and then you add on top of that wildfires. You might be adding on top of that indoor air pollution, for example, from like a gas stove or something else. So, the health impacts that we experience are really the sum of all those things, and that's kind of important to remember. Not everyone feels that equally. So this is a map from NOAA, the Weather Service, that just shows some of the patterns of the smoke coming all the way from Western Canada, all the way down, and then making this kind of wild turn, right, and then coming down through Boston and New York. And my daughter lives in Philadelphia, and she had some of the worst air quality in the country, even though the source was coming from so far away. So that's sort of the problem, or one of the problems, as part of the bigger issue of climate change. So then the question is, well, what do we do about this? And this is a figure from the Massachusetts Climate Action Plan that talks about kind of the key things that we need to be doing. So, sort of shorthand is we need to be transitioning away from fossil fuels, more renewable energy. Really, in this area, it means primarily, right here, it means solar. Across the state, it means wind, including offshore wind plus solar. And then it also means probably, continuing to bring in, hydropower from Canada and so on. The second thing is more energy efficiency. The more efficient we can be, the less energy we need to produce, and that really helps as well. The third thing is we need to make sure that the energy we do use comes from a clean grid. And one of the things that is part of this whole energy transition is moving things away from fossil fuels toward being powered by electricity. So that means getting away from oil and gas fired furnaces and moving more toward electric heat pumps, for example. That only works if that electricity comes from renewable sources. And then the final piece of the puzzle here is basically doing what we can to keep removing carbon from the atmosphere. And currently, the best thing we have operating for us is called a tree, right? I mean, so we need to think about the impact of trees and other natural systems that can remove carbon from the atmosphere. Because even if we do all these things, there's probably going to be some things we're not going to be able to avoid in terms of carbon pollution. So that's kind of the big picture. And then one thing I thought was really great in the state's climate action plan is they said, okay, if we do this, what does it look like? Well, we have better air quality. We have more innovation happening. We have more trees in urban areas, and that means that helps with extreme heat, but also makes it a nicer place to live. We have more efficient heating, which will probably cost us less. We have less air pollution and less noise from vehicles, and we have more jobs, and this could be good. So the thing is that if we make this transition, it's going to take a lot of change. It's going to take deep retrofits of buildings, houses, factories, etc. If we don't do this, it's also going to take big changes. So this is the positive view of the future that I think we can point ourselves to. So then there's this question: well, how can we get ourselves there? And one of the things that is really important is that taking action on climate requires us as citizens to get involved. And there's this paradox that a majority of Americans, by last count, 72%, believe that climate change is important, that it's happening now. Yet something like almost 2/3 of Americans discuss climate change only rarely with their friends and family. And why is that? Why do you guys think that is? Is it depressing? Sometimes, yes. Does it feel overwhelming? Yes. Are you afraid? Are you afraid that maybe someone won't agree with you? Or you're just afraid that it's going to happen? Right? All those things. Complacency. And, I'd say up until recently, one of the issues is people couldn't.
Or just plain disbelief.
Or plain disbelief. Or just feeling like, I don't see it, I don't feel it. I think that's changing a bit, right? But there is still this real disparity. And this really plays out a bit differently across the country. And this is a map from the Yale project on climate change communication. And what you can see is that the areas in green are the places where people are talking about climate change more than average, and then the purple is less than average. So you can see not a lot going on in the south relative to what's, in the northeast and Massachusetts, yes, a lot more talk. But still, we're talking about a few percentage points different from that 2/3 who are not talking about it at all. So the interesting thing is that, and this is based on more of the research from the folks down at Yale, is that the more people talk about climate change with their family and friends, they're more likely to actually support changes and policies to deal with it. And it turns out that discussing climate change with family and friends is the only predictor of climate change being important as a voting issue, which is really interesting. Like, if you don't talk about it, it doesn't count. It's really interesting. That doesn't mean that you have to argue with everyone about it, but it means you have to think about finding the common ground. So another interesting thing is that when you talk about climate change, if you talk about it in a way that's hopeful, it has much more of an impact. If you can see what the solutions might be and help people understand that, because people who are hopeful are more likely to talk about climate change, and they're also more likely to support the changes that we need, and they're more likely to actually act. And that's partly because if you feel like there's no hope, there's no action. And I would argue that hope is not, hope is an action. Hope is a verb, right? It's not just a feeling. And without hope, there is no action. And I think it's really important, to understand that connection between hope and action. It's not just wishing it were better. It's being willing to advocate for the changes that we need to make things better. So I really want to sort of zero in on that idea of hope being really important. Yeah.
Quite often, people that are wanting better air move. They just go further up to further away from where they think there is.
That's really interesting. And right.
Rather
than act locally. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things about the wildfires that really brought home to everyone is that there is nowhere to go. There is nowhere to go. It's all one atmosphere. What goes around comes around. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the Hitchcock Center and how we're involved in climate change. We're the Hitchcock Center for the Environment. We're very concerned about environmental issues and about environmental education. And, as many of you know, we have this really wonderful sustainable living building, which was built as a model, kind of a working model for what a sustainable future could look like in terms of a building. So it's net zero energy. It recycles a ton of its own materials. It uses non-toxic materials. It does it in a way that's aesthetically really quite wonderful. So it's a beautiful building and very livable. And one of the reasons that I came to the Hitchcock Center was to help figure out, well, we have the building, so how do we have programs that support the vision that's behind that building? And so what we've been working on is really thinking about how we can develop young people who are hopeful and creative and who can actually problem solve some of the issues that we're going to be facing. This climate change issue isn't going away fast. We need people who can help deal with it now and into the future. And what we do is we've been partnering more and more with schools and community groups to create programs that help promote learning and action related to the environment and climate change. And with slightly older youth, the teens, we've been working on helping them develop the skills that they need to really serve as climate activists. A lot of them already are climate activists, and we're really trying to support them with skills. And then we also really want to help bring together and convene adults to learn and talk about climate change, because as I was saying before, if you don't talk about it, you really aren't going to get the action to happen. And one of the things that this is based on a great paper that came out of the Brookings Institution. One of the things we need is a new kind of framework for what skills young people need, and part of it has to do with what are called like green job skills, and those are sort of like the direct skills you need. For example, we need a ton of wind turbine technicians now. We need solar installers. We need people who can actually do the work related to this energy transition. We need people to retrofit all of those houses and buildings over the next years and decades. But then there's a whole set of life skills and kind of transformative skills that young people need that have to do with being adaptable, being able to collaborate, being able to think critically, being able to problem solve, being able to really kind of forge collective action to work together, to think about systems, etc. And part of what we're trying to do is think about how can we play a part in developing these skills among young people. And so what that means for us is that part of what we help do is help young people develop a relationship with the natural world so they can learn from it to develop more sustainable systems. Because that's in essence what our living building is. It's a building that's designed on natural design principles. But also we help young people learn about engineering and design in the context of sustainability so they can become more problem solvers. And then as I was saying that, for youth, especially teens, we help them learn the kind of communication and leadership skills they can use to really share this kind of positive vision for the future. And so, we're really creating kind of a bridge between what I would call kind of nature education, which is the sort of legacy of the Hitchcock Center, to really focusing more on a kind of more well-rounded environment and climate education kind of approach. And then I want to talk a little bit about, well, who is this for? Who is all this education for? So this slide is just looking at Amherst Public Schools and who's enrolled in the Amherst Public Schools. And when I first uncovered this data and started sharing with people, including at the Hitchcock Center staff, including our board, people are like, really? I don't know if I believe that. But in fact, if you look at who is in the Amherst Public Schools, the majority of students are non-white. And if you look at the level of need in Amherst, you find that something like 37% of students are low income. More than 50% are considered high need by one of these criteria, including disabilities or English language learner or not having their first language is English. So Amherst is a much more diverse school district than you might suspect just thinking about, Amherst College, who lives here. And one of the things that we're trying really hard to do is make sure we are serving that diversity in our programs, which we do through the public schools, but we also want to make sure we do it through our programs on site, like our summer camps and so on. And then we're also paying attention to who are the populations in the region who are disproportionately impacted by social, economic, and environmental issues. And this is a map of what are considered environmental justice populations in the state, and they're color-coded in different ways. So green is income, yellow is a minority population, the blue is English isolation, so non-English speakers. And so this is a map of the entire state, and there are actually maps like this for the entire country. And then if you zero in a bit on Western Mass, what you see is that this is Holyoke and Springfield, where the sort of the largest populations are that meet some of these criteria. But also you see there are parts of Amherst and as you get up into Franklin County and Greenfield and Orange and Athol, there are a bunch of communities that are facing some of these challenges that all of those other challenges that I talked about before in terms of health challenges and environmental challenges, they all stack up on top of these things. And so one of the things that we've been working on is developing more partnerships particularly in places like Springfield and Holyoke, so that we can more effectively address some folks who are really disproportionately impacted by all of these environmental and climate issues. So we've been working in partnership with the Holyoke Y for the last couple of years to add some science and environmental programming. We go down to Holyoke and do that programming with our educators, and usually in the summer, some of the kids will come up for a field trip to the Hitchcock Center. And then also we're working with the Springfield Public Schools to do engineering design challenges with all of their third graders over 3 years through a federal grant. So that's like 100 classrooms over 3 years. Really trying to do our part to make sure that the programs we deliver are really equitably reaching people in the area. And so this is just an example of a couple of things that we're doing related to air quality. And this here is actually the air quality sensor we have that measures those small particles that's on the side of the Hitchcock Center. And this is Dan, one of our lead educators, who's doing a little experiment showing that if you take a candle and you then blow it out in a little glass box with an air sensor in it, you can actually detect the particles coming off the smoke from the candle. And this is the same sensor that we have, the same kind of sensor that we have up on the building, so you can kind of see how it works. And then one of the next things we did is, as we realized last summer that the air quality was really getting unhealthy in a lot of places across the region, is doing a lot of outreach to the community to help explain this and get the word out. And we found that our social media was really effective in doing this. We reached thousands of people. And also a lot of the parents who were coming to our summer camp were asking us questions. They're saying, like, well, what do we do? And how do we know what's going on? And we were referring to them to this healthy air network that has been developing all these sensors, because you can get really pretty local data on where the air quality is, not just generally in the region, but pretty close to you. So, and then one of the other things that we did is we borrowed a method that had been developed during COVID for developing low-cost air cleaners, where basically, do any of you have air cleaners in your home? Like, yep, and you probably went out and bought one. Like, you turn on the button, and it probably tells you the air quality, and then it also turns on the filter. And it turns out you can do something pretty similar with just a 2x2 foot box fan and a furnace filter that you can buy from Home Depot. So for about $30, you can do something pretty reasonable. They've been tested against some of the high-quality air filters. About 80% is effective, which is pretty good. So, we started putting out information about these because if people didn't have or couldn't afford, a dedicated air cleaner, this is something that they could do pretty quickly on their own. You just duct tape it on and off you go. These are pretty effective for COVID as well. And actually, one of the things that Dan and I have been developing is a design challenge where kids can experiment with different materials to figure out what makes an effective air filter. So we were playing around with felt and cotton wool and all sorts of stuff to see kind of what actually what it works, and if it's too porous, it lets too much through. But if it's too if it's like a thick cloth, it doesn't let any air through, so you can't actually filter much air. So it turns out furnace filters are very carefully designed to balance those two things, which is kind of cool. And then the last thing I wanted to leave you with is this is a quote from a woman named Catherine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist from Texas, who has some very conservative relatives, and she's written about this a lot and spoke about it a lot. She wrote a great book called Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. And this is a great quote from her book. She says, "Use your voice to talk about why climate change matters to you here and now. Use it to share what you are doing, what others are doing, and what they can do. Use it to advocate for change at every level. Use it to vote and to inform decisions your school, your business, your city, and your country can make. Talk about it in every community that you are part of and whose values and interests you share. And I'll leave you with that. So, thanks. So happy to answer any questions or.
You guys have any questions?
Yeah. Yes.
And I would like to consider adding the fifth one, which is people's habits of wastefulness. And one of those personal habits would be moving toward a plant-based diet. A reason
Yeah.
I don't talk to people is, for example, I don't want to get into a fight with my niece because she's riding airplanes all the time.
Yeah.
And I don't want to have, so it's a trade-off with a personal relationship and trying to educate somebody. So I tend to not want to bring that up.
Yeah. That's.
People don't want to change.
Well, it's interesting. That's a really interesting point because, I think one of the things that's really challenging in the kind of environmental world is that environmentalists tend to want to tell people to do stuff like that isn't always easy to do or people don't want to do. And I feel like often, we're, as environmentalists, we're put in the position of like sharing bad news and like, who wants to hear bad news? Who wants to hear that I can't do something I want to do? And I think one of the things that has been helpful is realizing that it doesn't have to be a complete, it doesn't have to be an absolute choice. So it doesn't have to be, okay, either I live a wasteful lifestyle or I live a completely clean lifestyle. And, I think, for example, the issue around diet is I think there's been a lot of progress in helping people realize, like, oh, okay, you don't have to go become a vegan or have a meatless diet, but, if you reduced your meat consumption by this amount, by like one meal a week or something like that, it probably would improve your health and it would actually help the environment and it would be good for animal welfare too. So, and I feel like helping people move by degrees is probably more effective than anything. And then I think the other thing is helping to identify, like, where is there a shared value that you can talk about? So, like, if it's with a family member, even sometimes when I completely disagree with someone, I can just say, yeah, it seems like you care about this issue a lot also, don't you? Even though we disagree. And so I think identifying, like, where is it that point of, common interest that you can work with is really helpful. And I agree with your point about, additional strategies that ought to be part of the kind of the climate action plan. There are some things that are just not in the climate action plan at all, and I think is one of them. And another one, just to, without getting deep down this rabbit hole, there's no mention anywhere of nuclear energy. It's just not even mentioned. And I feel like we have to talk about it. Like, I don't know what we do about it, but we have to talk about it. So I think that's why I would say more talk is good. Yeah.
Most of your talk has been about more the urban environment and how you're
Mm-hmm.
Massachusetts is also very rural state.
Mm-hmm.
And I was
Mm-hmm.
wondering what your opinion might be. Recently, Vermont has come out with this proposal for batteries for individuals rather than building the grid for
Yeah,
things.
yeah,
And
yeah.
to me, it seems so affirming for individuality
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
you have your own battery at your house that will
Yep.
you,
Yeah.
you will have your panels, but then
Yeah.
you become self-sufficient. And I was wondering if you had heard, because you're hooked in,
Yeah.
especially
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
statewide, any discussion of that coming to Massachusetts?
Oh, that's
Seems
really
like a great
interesting.
idea.
Yeah, one of the issues that is associated with the transition to renewables is that we need a different power grid system. And even now, when people are trying to install solar, especially at a bigger scale than a house, There's a lot of challenges figuring out how to hook up to the grid, and the grid needs to change because the grid is used to now just supplying energy in one direction and at sort of a constant rate, and solar is a whole different ballgame. And then storage needs to happen probably at a big level and at a local, like house-by-house level. And that is a big change that needs to happen, and I feel like there is a lot of opportunity there, whether it's people having their electric cars serve as batteries or having local battery storage. One of the challenges has been that battery storage, the technology hasn't advanced enough to make it safe, affordable, and environmentally okay. And I think that's one of the questions I have at the Hitchcock Center is like, could we have battery storage that would enable us to be completely grid-free without having like a huge pile of lithium next to the center? So I don't know particularly of an initiative in the state to make that happen. There is a lot of innovation being funded, but that's a great question. I'll follow up on that one. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
It's also interesting to me that the solar power that I generate on my house goes to Eversource, but then I have to pay for them to deliver it back to me.
Yeah.
It's a very lopsided equation.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you foresee any advocacy in making that more equitable, which would make it more affordable.
Yeah. The pricing around electricity is complicated. What's that?
It costs more.
Yeah.
Read
Yeah.
the fine print on the back of whatever source sent
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
It's quite a bit more money
Yeah.
to not just do all electricity, but to do it with the solar
Yeah.
energy.
Yeah.
And they keep ignoring me when I say this makes no sense. If you have no money, you cannot pay more.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And you could also wash with cold water and dry your wash outside.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can teach your children to teach their children to walk in the
Yeah,
parks
yeah.
and all the beautiful
Yeah.
nature and not spend money to fly them to Disney World.
Yeah.
I
That
mean,
is all true.
It's
Right.
choices we
Right.
have.
Those are right. Right. No, I mean that's right. I mean we live in a fairly privileged world where we get to make a lot of choices,
Yeah.
and we can make better choices and less good choices. I think one of the things that is important to keep in mind, though, is that those choices that we have, we didn't get to determine exactly what those choices are. So, like, we didn't decide, all of us in this room, like, what Eversource was going to do and how that works. We didn't decide that, food was going to be delivered and all these consumer products and all this packaging that we never asked for. There are, and so that's where the civic engagement side becomes really important to ask these questions, and I think and to think about like how can we change the system. I think the Vermont example is a great one where Vermont has made a lot of intentional choices over the years to be a certain kind of a state, and it's really interesting. Like I find when if I'm driving up to Vermont and I cross the border into Vermont from Massachusetts, suddenly the bakeries get better, and like you'll be in some little tiny town in Vermont and have like some really incredible restaurant, and that happens or incredible hardware store, right, and it happens to some degree in Massachusetts, but I've wondered about what is it that Vermont has done to encourage that, and what could we do to promote that. So it's really interesting to like question, not only the choices you're making, but who created the choices and how can we change what those available choices are. Yeah.
Another thought I had when Cheryl was mentioning talking with a younger person is that where was I at 17?
Yeah.
I maybe knew two people, and they were my parents.
Yeah.
Who did a lot of things that we propose now, but
Mm-hmm.
at my age, I did not, or at that age, I did
Right,
not think
right,
about climate
right,
change
right.
at all.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So that could be a starting point.
Yeah.
How did I get to
Right.
where my concern is at now?
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing that's interesting among a lot of young people, like they feel this stuff very viscerally, deeply, and some are angry. Some of the folks who are really active that we work with are overwhelmed because they get really deep into it. Like they're on like 5 different climate groups, in high school, and they're trying to do high school and sports and have friends, and so part of what we try to do is help give them the kind of emotional support. Like you don't have to do this alone. You're with other people. We're with you. We're caring adults. We're with you. Your peers are with you. But it's really challenging, and there's a lot of climate stress out there. Yeah.
Are you familiar with NextAmp?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. We've been part of that for
Yeah,
7
yeah,
or 8 years.
yeah.
And it just was a fluke that we got involved in it, and I don't always understand the whole thing because you become part of it without investing anything. But you become part of it, and when they get a certain number of people who sign on, they build a solar installment.
Yeah.
And then you begin receiving money back.
Yeah.
And it goes through, I don't understand it completely, but it's very nice because we get a $30 or so check a month from NextAmp.
Yeah.
That, helps to offset a little bit of our
Yeah, no,
insurance.
that's great.
It doesn't cost us
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah, and the other thing I just mentioned is I don't think it's available yet in Amherst, but I know it is in Hadley where we live, is community choice solar, where basically you just check off a box and instead of getting your electricity sourced from wherever Eversource wants to source it, you can say, I want renewable energy. And basically the town is doing like a collective purchase agreement to buy.
And does that lower your electric bill?
It's depending on which track you're in, it's pretty close. I can't remember. I think there's one option that may be a little lower, one that's a little higher, depending on what you choose. Yeah.